6:47 a.m., March 3rd, 2026. Phoenix, Arizona. 14 DEA armored vehicles rolled in formation down West McDowell Road, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gray. Behind them, 12 unmarked ATF units, engines idling low. Across 2 states, at 31 separate addresses, federal agents waited for the same signal. Estimated seizure target, 4. 8 million counterfeit fentanyl tablets per quarter. Street value, $147 million annually. The signal came at 6:51 a.m. In the next 4 minutes, 35 simultaneous entries would occur across Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, and 4 warehouse addresses in the desert between them. 2 licensed pharmacists, both with clean DEA registration numbers, both processing legitimate prescriptions that morning, would be in handcuffs before their coffee went cold. This is Operation S-Script 0. What made it the largest pharmaceutical-front takedown in DEA Southwest Region history wasn't the pill count. It wasn't the cash. It was the fact that for 14 months, nobody inside the network knew they were being watched. Not the warehouse managers, not the billing coordinators, not the 2 pharmacists running the counterfeit volume through their own dispensing terminals. Nobody except the man driving the delivery van. The first anomaly surfaced in November 2025, not in Phoenix. In Tucson, DEA diversion investigator Sandra Reyes had spent 11 years auditing pharmacy dispensing records across southern Arizona. Her caseload covered dozens of active pharmacies at any given time. Routine audits, hydrocodone refill pattern analysis, Schedule II documentation checks. The work was methodical, mostly quiet. On November 4th, 2025, Reyes pulled the quarterly dispensing summary for a pharmacy chain operating under the corporate name Sonoran Health Partners. The chain held 31 licensed locations across Arizona and New Mexico, with a central compliance office registered in Scottsdale. State board certifications were current. DEA registrations were clean. The chain had received a Regional Pharmacy Association Wellness Award 18 months earlier. One location's numbers stopped her cold. The Sonoran Health Partners branch at 4412 South 6th Avenue, Tucson. A mid-sized storefront in a strip mall anchored by a dollar store and a nail salon, had processed 14,200 hydrocodone refill transactions in the 3rd quarter of 2025. That number was 3 times the volume of any comparable pharmacy outlet in the state, measured against active patient census. The patient census for that location, 847 registered patients. Industry standard for a pharmacy serving 847 patients, roughly 4,200 Schedule II transactions per quarter, maximum. The gap between those 2 numbers, 4,200 versus 14,200, was approximately 10,000 dispensing events with no plausible legitimate explanation. Reyes flagged the discrepancy to her supervisor and requested a cross-reference audit on all 31 Sonoran Health Partners locations. The cross-reference came back 10 days later. 3 other locations showed elevated hydrocodone volumes, not as extreme as the 6th Avenue branch, but statistically impossible for their patient census sizes. The remaining 27 locations showed normal dispensing patterns. That distribution, 4 outliers inside a 31-location corporate structure with 27 clean, was itself a data point. It suggested deliberate compartmentalization. Someone had engineered the volume to stay below thresholds that would trigger automated DEA alerts, spread across enough locations to avoid pattern recognition. Reyes wrote a 4-page memo and forwarded it to the DEA Phoenix Field Division. The memo landed on the desk of Group Supervisor Daniel Ortega on November 18, 2025. Ortega read it twice. Then he made 3 calls. The first call went to the DEA's Office of Diversion Control in Arlington. The second went to ATF Phoenix. The third went to a man named Marcus Webb, a DEA undercover specialist who, at that moment, was between assignments and based out of the Tucson resident office. Ortega told Webb, "We need someone inside a pharmacy delivery network. Long term. You up for it?" Webb said yes. He had no way of knowing the assignment would run 14 months. Webb's cover identity had been built over the previous year for a different operation that never launched. The backstory was solid. A former logistics dispatcher named Kevin Garza, background in regional freight, minor drug conviction from 2019 that had been expunged. The kind of record that made him plausible to an employer who wasn't asking too many questions, but didn't set off alarm bells. The insertion point was straightforward. Sonoran Health Partners used a third-party delivery contractor called Desert Route Logistics for interbranch pharmaceutical transfers, moving inventory between warehouse locations and retail branches on a weekly schedule. Desert Route Logistics was a legitimate company, unaware of what some of its clients were actually moving. Webb applied for a driver position in early December 2025 and was hired within a week. His first delivery run was December 11th, 2025. The route took him from a warehouse on West Lower Buckeye Road in Phoenix to 4 branch locations in the metro area. Standard pharmaceutical inventory, sealed cardboard cartons with DEA chain of custody documentation attached. Nothing visually unusual. On that first run, Webb did nothing except drive, deliver, and observe. What he observed: the warehouse on Lower Buckeye Road was staffed by 8 employees during his pickup window, none of whom matched the names on the Desert Route Logistics client contact sheet. The receiving supervisor, a man who signed paperwork under the name D. Quintoro, wore a Sinaloa Braves baseball cap and spoke to a second man in Spanish throughout the entire loading process. The conversation, which Webb recorded through a concealed audio device, referenced quantities using a counting system that didn't correspond to the carton count being loaded onto the van. Webb flagged this in his debrief that evening. Ortega reviewed the audio. A Spanish language analyst confirmed the count referenced in the conversation was approximately double the manifest count. There were 2 loads being managed at that warehouse, one on paper, one not. Going through the surveillance logs from Webb's first 3 months on this operation, one pattern kept surfacing that the summary reports almost buried. The secondary inventory, the counterfeit M30 fentanyl tablets, wasn't stored at the warehouse on Lower Buckeye Road. It was staged elsewhere and loaded at a secondary transfer point that Webb didn't initially have access to. It took him 6 weeks to find it. The secondary transfer point was a self-storage facility on West Van Buren Street, 8 minutes from the Lower Buckeye warehouse. Webb identified it on January 22, 2026, when a route deviation was added to his schedule without explanation. A detour that added 23 minutes to a standard run and required him to back the van into storage unit 114 while 2 men transferred sealed gray plastic totes from the unit into his cargo bay. The gray totes never appeared on any manifest document. They were loaded after the DEA chain of custody paperwork was already completed. Anyone reviewing the paper trail would see a clean delivery. Anyone watching the loading dock would see something else entirely. Webb photographed the exterior of Unit 114 using a button camera. DEA surveillance identified the storage unit leaseholder as a shell entity registered in Nevada. It took 12 days of financial forensics to connect that entity to a Scottsdale medical billing company named Meridian Claims Processing. Meridian Claims Processing was the second layer of the operation, and what agents found there complicated everything. Meridian Claims Processing occupied a single-story commercial suite in a Scottsdale business park, 40 minutes from the nearest Sonoran Health Partners branch. It employed 17 people: coders, billing coordinators, a compliance officer, and a general manager named Patricia Howell, who had worked in medical billing for 22 years and whose LinkedIn profile listed 3 professional certifications. Meridian's stated function: insurance claim processing for independent healthcare providers across Arizona. Meridian's actual function, as reconstructed from financial records obtained under a sealed federal subpoena issued January 30th, 2026, processing approximately $9 million per month in fictitious insurance claims on behalf of provider entities that did not exist. The mechanics were clean, in the way that sophisticated fraud is clean. Meridian had access to real patient data: names, insurance ID numbers, diagnosis codes, obtained through a data broker operating out of the Caribbean. The billing coordinators used this data to generate claims for services that were never rendered, submitted to insurance carriers under provider numbers associated with shell medical practices registered in 3 states. The insurance payments flowed into accounts controlled by the same financial structure that owned the storage unit on West Van Buren Street, $9 million per month. Processed by 17 employees who, based on DEA financial investigators' subsequent analysis, were operating at 2 levels. Some knew exactly what Meridian was doing. Others were processing claims according to instructions they had no reason to question. One thing the financial summary reports don't quite capture: the fraud running through Meridian wasn't built to make money quickly. It was built to make money consistently, at a volume just low enough to avoid triggering carrier fraud detection algorithms, spread across enough claim types and enough carrier accounts to look like a busy regional billing operation. The people who designed this system weren't improvising. They had built something engineered to run for years. What a case like this reveals about pharmaceutical-front operations is the infrastructure behind them. The pills were the product. The pharmacy chain was the distribution point. The billing company was the laundry. 3 layers of legitimate-looking business activity, each defensible on its own, each dependent on the others. Dismantle one, and the others can survive. Dismantle all 3 simultaneously. That requires a different kind of operation entirely. That was what S-Script 0 was building toward. By February 2026, Webb had been running routes for Sonoran Health Partners' delivery network for 11 weeks. His access had expanded. He was now assigned to the 2 highest volume transfer routes in the network, the runs between the West Van Buren storage facility and the 4 Sonoran branches processing counterfeit volume. What those routes revealed, the counterfeit M30 tablets were not distributed uniformly across the 31-branch network. 4 branches: 6th Avenue, Tucson, Indian School Road, Phoenix, Coors Boulevard, Albuquerque, and a location in Chandler, handled the bulk of the counterfeit volume. These 4 branches had something in common. Each was managed by a pharmacist who had direct access to the dispensing terminal and who processed prescriptions without a second pharmacist present during specific shift windows. DEA identified 2 of those pharmacists as central to the scheme: Dr. Raymond Castillo, registered pharmacist and branch manager at the 6th Avenue Tucson location, and Dr. Elena Varga, branch manager at the Indian School Road Phoenix branch. Both had clean DEA registration records. Both had no prior disciplinary history with the State Pharmacy Board. Both had been employed by Sonoran Health Partners for more than 3 years. What they had been doing during those 3 years, processing real prescriptions alongside counterfeit volume, using the legitimate dispensing activity to mask the counterfeit transactions in the terminal record. A patient coming in with a valid hydrocodone prescription would be served normally. During that same shift, the same terminal would process counterfeit M30 fentanyl tablets through a parallel transaction stream, logged under patient records pulled from the stolen data set that fed Meridian's billing operation. The operational elegance of it was that the counterfeit transactions looked, in the dispensing record, like legitimate fills. They had patient names. They had prescription numbers. They had insurance billing attached. Insurance billing processed by Meridian. The entire paper trail was synthetic, but it was complete. Worth saying plainly, Castillo and Varga knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't being coerced into a role they didn't understand. Both held doctoral-level pharmaceutical training. Both had operated within the scheme for years. The sentence each of them would eventually face, we'll come to that, should reflect the specific expertise they deployed in service of distributing a product that has killed tens of thousands of Americans. Pharmacist credentials aren't mitigation in a fentanyl case. They're an aggravating factor. The first major obstacle hit on February 9th, 2026. Webb's primary covert recording device, a modified phone unit that had been transmitting audio from delivery runs to a DEA relay vehicle, failed during a pickup at the West Van Buren storage facility. The failure happened mid-conversation between Webb and the loading supervisor during a discussion that appeared to involve scheduling changes for the following week's runs. The relay vehicle team lost signal for 14 minutes. By the time Webb reached his next delivery stop and was able to signal a technical problem through a pre-arranged indicator, the conversation was unrecoverable. The scheduling information lost in that 14-minute window took DEA analysts 8 days to reconstruct through cross-reference with surveillance footage from cameras positioned near the storage facility entrance. The reconstruction worked, but it cost time the operation couldn't easily spare. Ortega's group was working toward a coordinated takedown window, and every week of delay was another week the network ran. The technical team replaced Webb's primary recording unit within 48 hours. A secondary backup unit, one that had been passive until then, was activated as a redundant system. But the incident had cost something else. Webb had been forced to improvise a cover explanation for why he'd taken longer than expected at the Van Buren stop, and the loading supervisor, a man Webb knew only as Lino, had watched him with visible attention as he left. Ortega reviewed Webb's debrief that night and made a decision: accelerate the timeline. They had enough evidence to build the warrant package. The risk of another technical failure, or, worse, a personnel failure, outweighed the investigative value of additional weeks on the ground. The warrant application process began February 14th, 2026. Was the call to compress the timeline the right one, or did moving early risk leaving gaps in the case that a defense team could exploit years later? It's a genuine question. Every federal prosecution involving undercover work carries that tension. Evidence, depth versus agent exposure. There's no clean answer. The warrant package for Operation S-Script 0 ran to 847 pages of affidavit, financial records, surveillance photographs, and audio transcripts. Assistant U, S. Attorney Lauren Marsh spent 9 days reviewing it before signing off on the submission to federal magistrate. The application covered 31 pharmacy locations, 4 warehouse and storage addresses, the Meridian Claims Processing Office in Scottsdale, and 14 individual targets including Castillo, Varga, and 7 individuals associated with the logistics and financial structure of the network. Magistrate approval came through February 24, 2026. Ortega's team had 9 days to build the operational plan for simultaneous execution across 2 states. The logistics were the hardest part. 31 pharmacy locations, spread across 2 metropolitan areas and 4 mid-sized cities, plus warehouse addresses and the Scottsdale billing office. 37 separate entry points requiring coordinated execution within a window narrow enough that no target would receive warning before federal agents were through their door. The problem: pharmacy locations open at different times. Some Sonoran Health Partners branches began dispensing at 8 a.m. Others opened at 9. 2 locations operated 24-hour drive-through windows that never closed. A full simultaneous entry at 6 a.m. would require holding positions for up to 3 hours for some teams, increasing the risk of civilian observation. A staggered entry would risk communication between targets. The solution: a soft perimeter model. Entry teams took positions at all 37 locations beginning at 5:30 a.m. on March 3, 2026, in standard civilian vehicles, maintaining surveillance posture only. No uniformed presence. No marked vehicles until the execution signal. The signal would go out at 6:51 a.m., timed to the moment the first Sonoran Health Partners branch location, the one with the 24-hour window, completed its morning staffing transition, ensuring both shift pharmacists were present. ATF joined the operation on the strength of intelligence. Webb had developed about 3 firearm caches, handguns, and 1 rifle, stored in back rooms at 3 specific Sonoran Health Partners locations. ATF Phoenix contributed 4 entry teams and explosive breaching capability for 2 of the warehouse addresses. Webb's role on March 3rd. He was scheduled to begin his regular delivery route at 7 a.m. He received a pre-arranged text message at 6:49 a.m. instructing him to deviate from his route for a vehicle inspection. He pulled into a DEA staging area on West Buckeye Road at 6:50 a.m. 1 minute later, 37 simultaneous entries began. The raid on the 6th Avenue Tucson branch lasted 4 minutes from initial breach to full personnel control. Entry team leader Special Agent Thomas Alvarez brought 6 agents through the front entrance at 6:51 a.m. Drive. Raymond Castillo was behind the dispensing counter, in the process of opening the morning. He looked up at the agents, looked at their tactical vests, and sat down without being told. He did not speak for 11 minutes. His hands, agents noted in the incident report, were steady. The dispensing terminal behind him was still showing the previous day's transaction log. Forensic analysts would spend the following 6 weeks reconstructing what those transaction records actually represented. 12 miles away, at the Indian School Road Phoenix branch, Dr. Elena Varga attempted to lock herself in the pharmacy's controlled substance storage room before entry team agents reached the dispensing area. She made it to the door, the lock mechanism engaged. The agents were through the secondary door and had physical control of Varga within 90 seconds of the room locking. The storage room, when opened, contained 47 sealed gray plastic totes, identical to those Webb had been moving through the Van Buren transfer point. Varga was arrested at 6:53 a.m. Castillo was arrested at 6:52 a.m. The 6-minute window Ortega had calculated for simultaneous arrests of both pharmacists. It came in at 62 seconds. At the West Van Buren storage facility, ATF entry teams found Unit 114 empty of totes. The morning's delivery run had already staged, but discovered a concealed secondary room behind a false wall at the rear of the unit. The room contained counting equipment, heat seal packaging machinery, and residue from the tablet pressing process. Evidence technicians processed the room for 11 hours. The warehouse on Lower Buckeye Road yielded the largest single seizure, 1 million counterfeit, M30 tablets in sealed packaging, staged for that week's distribution run. The tablets were tested at the DEA Southwest laboratory within 36 hours. Fentanyl content, approximately 1 milligrams per tablet. Fatal dose for a fentanyl-naive individual, approximately 2 milligrams. Each tablet in that warehouse was capable of killing a person who had no tolerance. 2,100,000 of them. $14 million in cash was recovered across 5 locations: the Scottsdale billing office, the Lower Buckeye warehouse, and 3 residential addresses associated with the network's financial layer. The cash was bundled in amounts that suggested regular collection cycles rather than accumulated reserves. ATF recovered 3 firearm caches, 11 handguns, and 1 semi-automatic rifle across 3 branch locations, as Webb's intelligence had indicated. 2 of the handguns were reported stolen in separate incidents in Hermosillo, Sonora, a detail that placed them in the same supply chain as the Sinaloa cartel cell the DEA had been tracking as the network's upstream supplier. The Meridian Claims Processing Office in Scottsdale was the last entry of the morning. Agents arrived at 8:03 a.m. after the office opened. 17 employees were present. 14 were interviewed on-site and released pending further investigation. 3, including General Manager Patricia Howell and 2 senior billing coordinators, were detained for additional questioning. Howell was arrested the following morning on federal fraud charges. The digital evidence from Meridian Claims Processing would take 4 months to fully process. The scale of the fictitious billing operation was larger than DEA financial investigators had initially estimated. Final documented figure, $9. $3 million per month in fraudulent insurance claims, running continuously from at least March 2025. Estimated total fraud across the 12-month window, $111, $6 million. The insurance carriers defrauded included 3 major national carriers and 2 federal health programs. Recovery of those funds would require civil litigation running years beyond the criminal case. Financial investigators working the network's money structure identified 11 bank accounts across 4 institutions, 2 cryptocurrency exchange accounts, and a property holding company in Scottsdale that had acquired 3 commercial properties in the preceding 18 months. Total traceable assets, $47 million. Total cash and assets seized at the time of the raid, $14 million. The gap between those 2 figures, $47 million documented, $14 million seized, represents money that had already moved. Where it went was the subject of ongoing investigation at the time of the initial indictments. The upstream connection to Hermosillo was not fully resolved by the S-Script Zero operation. DEA worked with Mexican federal authorities under a bilateral coordination framework, but the Sinaloa cell identified as the tablet press supplier remained operational beyond the border. The 2 individuals identified through financial forensics as the cell's primary U.S. contacts, referred to in court documents only as Subject A and Subject B, had left the country before March 3rd. Whether they were tipped off or whether they departed for unrelated reasons was a question the investigation could not definitively answer. Here's what doesn't sit cleanly in the case summary. The network had 31 locations and a corporate compliance office, a medical billing company, a multi-warehouse logistics operation, and a cartel supply chain running across an international border. Something that large requires coordination. Coordination requires communication. And communication, over 14 months of DEA surveillance, should have produced a clearer picture of the top of the organizational structure than what S-Script Zero ultimately delivered. The indictments named 17 individuals, Castillo and Varga, Howell from Meridian. 6 members of the logistics and warehouse operation, including Lino, identified as Rodrigo Linares, a Mexican national with a valid U.S. work visa and no prior criminal record in either country. 4 individuals in the financial structure. 2 associated with the upstream supply chain who were indicted in absentia. The person who owned Sonoran Health Partners, the actual beneficial owner of the corporate entity, behind 2 layers of holding companies, was not among those 17. A name appeared in financial documents. DEA forwarded it to federal prosecutors. As of the date of the final indictment filing, that name had not produced an arrest. Sentencing for the principal defendants began June 2026. Raymond Castillo pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances and 1 count of healthcare fraud. Agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigation. Sentencing guidelines, 12 to 15 years. Final sentence, pending cooperation evaluation. Elena Varga pleaded not guilty, retained private counsel. Trial date set for November 2026. Patricia Howell pleaded guilty to 1 count of healthcare fraud conspiracy. Agreed to cooperate. Sentenced to 7 years federal prison, no parole. Rodrigo Linares pleaded not guilty. Detained without bail on grounds of flight risk. Trial scheduled. The 2 defendants indicted in absentia. No extradition agreement in place. No custody. Webb. Marcus Webb, whose 14 months of daily exposure to a cartel-connected pharmaceutical network produced the evidence that made this case, returned to the DEA Tucson resident office in early March 2026. He was assigned a desk position pending reassignment. The nature of undercover work in drug enforcement is that you can't unlearn a face, and you can't use an identity twice. The Kevin Garza cover was burned. Webb was done driving pharmacy vans. What he had delivered, in 14 months of delivery routes and concealed audio recordings and daily risk calculations, was a case file that took prosecutors 4 months to fully read. One detail that stays with me about this investigation: at no point in the 14 months did anyone inside the Sonoran Health Partners network directly question Webb's cover. Nobody ran the Kevin Garza background deeper than the basic check Desert Route Logistics conducted at hiring. Nobody flagged the fact that Garza was consistently assigned the highest volume routes. Nobody noticed that the van was taking slightly longer than the route time should have allowed. The network had built sophisticated defenses against regulatory detection, against pharmacological pattern analysis, against financial tracing. It had not built defenses against a quiet man doing a boring job for 14 months. The 31 Sonoran Health Partners locations were closed simultaneously on March 3, 2026. Their state pharmacy licenses were suspended by the Arizona State Board of Pharmacy within 48 hours. Legitimate patients. The 847 registered at the 6th Avenue Tucson branch, the thousands more across the remaining locations, were notified by mail and directed to alternative pharmacy services. Some had been picking up real prescriptions. Some had been unknowing participants in the dispensing record fraud, their names and insurance numbers used to process counterfeit transactions they never saw. The 1 million counterfeit M30 tablets seized at the Lower Buckeye warehouse were transported to DEA destruction facilities. The tablet pressing equipment from the Van Buren storage unit was retained as evidence. The $14 million in cash went into federal asset forfeiture proceedings. The Hermosillo cell continued operating. The beneficial owner of Sonoran Health Partners had not been arrested. And somewhere in the financial architecture of a network that moved an estimated $147 million in counterfeit fentanyl annually, architecture that ran through real pharmacy licenses, real insurance billing systems, real corporate compliance documents, there is likely still money that nobody has found. Will operations like Script Zero become a permanent feature of pharmaceutical enforcement? Or is the DEA running a structural deficit against a supply chain that simply reconfigures faster than federal investigations can keep pace with? Drop YES or no in the comments. We read every one. Subscribe now. The next case in this series goes deeper into the financial architecture of pharmacy front operations and the federal agency that almost missed this one entirely. The network is dismantled. The 2 million tablets are gone. The demand that created them is unchanged. And somewhere along a supply route between Hermosillo and Phoenix, the people who ran this operation long enough to make $111 million are deciding what to build next.